The fog clung to the forest like a living thing, swallowing shapes and muffling sound. She had been watching the cubs play near the treeline, their small dark forms darting in and out of the mist, until they didn't come back. Minutes passed. Then 10. Then, without a sound, they emerged again, but they weren't playing anymore. They stood stiff, staring at her with eyes that seemed too old for their young faces. And then, one of them turned and began walking back into the fog, looking over its shoulder as if to say, "Follow me." She had always thought of the forest as a place of gentle secrets. The kind you stumbled upon in silence, a patch of wild berries hidden in a sunlit clearing, a deer pausing mid-step to look at you as if deciding whether you belonged. It was her sanctuary, one she visited almost every morning before the rest of the world stirred. That's why she noticed the cubs in the first place. They'd appeared a few weeks ago, two small, wobbling bundles of fur, never far from each other. No mother in sight. She'd told herself not to get attached, but every day she found her eyes drifting toward the treeline, searching for them. They were cautious at first, keeping their distance. But over time, curiosity won over fear. They started lingering, watching her from behind tree trunks or curling near the rocks at the forest's edge. She never fed them, she knew the dangers of that, but she spoke softly, letting them get used to the sound of her voice. This morning, the fog was thicker than she'd ever seen it. It dulled the colors of everything, turning the pine needles into shades of silver, and making the air taste faintly of damp earth. The cubs were there at first, chasing each other near a fallen log. She'd smiled, pulling her scarf tighter, wondering how such small creatures could make the air feel warmer. Then one darted toward the mist, vanishing into it. The other followed without hesitation. She waited, leaning against the old fence post at the edge of her property, her breath visible in the cold air. It wasn't unusual for them to wander, but they always came back within a few minutes. 10 passed. She called out, her voice barely carrying in the heavy air. No sound came back, not the scamper of paws, not the faint rustle of undergrowth. Just silence, thick and absolute. She was on the verge of stepping into the fog herself when they returned. It wasn't the way she expected. They emerged slowly, side by side, but their movements were deliberate, almost wary. Their playfulness was gone. Their little heads were low, ears twitching at every sound. They stopped a few yards from her and just stared. She took a step forward, and one of them shifted its weight, almost like it was bracing itself. She froze, confused. The cub on the right, the slightly bigger one, glanced back toward the forest, then forward at her. Its eyes held something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear, exactly. More like urgency. Then, without warning, it turned and began walking back into the fog. Not running, walking. Slow enough that she could follow, but never looking away for too long. The smaller cub stayed put for a heartbeat, then padded after its sibling. She stood there, her pulse thudding in her ears. Every instinct told her that following wild animals into dense fog was a bad idea. She had no visibility, no way of knowing what lay ahead. But the cubs had never acted like this before. Something had changed in them, and that change pulled at her in a way she couldn't explain. She tightened her grip on her jacket zipper, took one last glance toward her cabin, and stepped forward into the mist. The fog swallowed her almost instantly. The world around her became a shifting wall of white, shapes barely forming before fading again. The only guide she had were the small dark forms ahead of her, their rounded ears and short legs just visible against the blur. She followed the sound of their soft footfalls on the damp ground, careful not to make too much noise. Minutes stretched strangely in the fog. She had no idea how far they'd gone, but the air was colder here, the smell of wet pine stronger. Once, she thought she heard something, a faint creak, like wood bending under weight. The cubs didn't react, so she kept moving. Then the bigger cub stopped. It turned its head toward the left, ears perked, nose twitching. The smaller one mimicked the motion. They stood there for a moment, listening. She strained to hear, but at first there was nothing. Then, so faint she almost thought she imagined it, came the sound of something moving through the trees. Not the quick scurry of a rabbit. Something heavier. The bigger cub gave a low chuff, not a growl, not a whine. The kind of sound that seemed meant for her, as if telling her to be alert. And for the first time, she realized she wasn't just following them. They were leading her somewhere. Her heart picked up speed. She glanced around, but the fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Still, she kept following as they veered slightly left, their pace steady, purposeful. It was then she noticed something odd on the ground. The moss and fallen needles had been disturbed, compressed into faint tracks. Human tracks. Not fresh enough to be crisp, but recent enough that the edges hadn't softened completely. They led in the same direction the cubs were going. She crouched, brushing her fingertips over one of the prints. Adult-sized. Hiking boots. She stood quickly, scanning the mist. The cubs were waiting, their dark eyes fixed on her. She took a deep breath, adjusted her scarf again, and whispered, "All right. I'm coming." They turned as one and moved forward. The fog shifted slightly, revealing the darker outlines of trees packed tighter together. The air grew heavier, carrying a scent she couldn't place, something metallic beneath the usual forest smells. Her footsteps slowed. She had the sudden feeling that whatever they were leading her toward wasn't going to be small. And she couldn't shake the thought that the cubs had come back for her on purpose. The deeper she went, the more the fog felt alive. It didn't just sit in the air, it moved, curling and shifting like it was deciding what to show her. The cubs were silent except for the occasional snap of twigs beneath their paws. She tried to match their quiet, each step deliberate, but every sound seemed amplified here, her boots compressing damp leaves, the faint swish of her jacket sleeve against her side. The forest felt different in the fog. She'd walked these woods countless times, but now she had no bearings. The tall pines that usually guided her were vague pillars in the mist. The familiar dip in the ground where rainwater pooled was just a dark smudge until she was right on top of it. Even the birds were silent. That silence pressed against her until she felt herself breathing quieter without meaning to. The cub stopped again. The bigger one tilted its head, ears twitching toward the right this time. She froze, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, came the sound of something rhythmic, soft, spaced out, but deliberate. She couldn't place it. Footsteps? Knocking? The sound seemed to come from far off, and yet, in the fog, distance was meaningless. The cubs didn't move right away. The smaller one glanced up at her as if checking that she was still there. She met its gaze and gave a small nod, though she wasn't sure why. Maybe to reassure herself as much as them. When they finally moved again, they veered slightly off the faint trail she'd been following. The ground dipped and rose, the roots of the pines thick and gnarled here. She had to watch every step to avoid tripping. Her boots slipped once on a slick patch of moss, and she caught herself on a low branch, its bark damp and cold beneath her fingers. Then, unexpectedly, she caught the scent she'd noticed earlier, sharper now. Metallic, but with a faint sweetness behind it. Her first thought was rust, maybe from an old tool or scrap of metal left out in the rain. But it didn't fade. It clung to the air, weaving in with the damp pine and soil until she found herself breathing shallower to avoid tasting it. The cubs slowed, their movements more careful. They were listening again. She followed their gaze and saw that the fog ahead seemed denser, like it had pooled between the trunks of the trees. Through it, something darker loomed, not a tree, but something more solid, angular. She took a few more steps, her boots muffled in the damp earth, and the shape resolved into a wooden structure. Not large, but not new either. Weathered boards, corners softened by years of rain and wind. It looked like an old hunting blind or storage shed, half swallowed by the forest. Moss had crept up its sides, and the roof sagged slightly under its own weight. The cubs stopped about 10 feet from it. The bigger one sat back on its haunches, eyes fixed on the dark gap where the door hung slightly ajar. The smaller one paced a slow half-circle, never taking its gaze off that shadow. She hesitated, her pulse climbing. Old buildings in the woods were rarely harmless. They had a way of holding on to things, tools, traps, sometimes worse. She considered turning back, telling herself she'd already come too far. But the cubs hadn't led her here for nothing. She could feel it in the way they watched her now, as if waiting for her reaction. She took one careful step closer. The smell was stronger here, and now she was almost certain it wasn't rust. It was too organic, too recent. A soft sound came from inside the shed. Not the rhythmic noise from before, this was sharper, more abrupt. A scrape, like something shifting against the floor. Her breath caught. She glanced at the cubs, but they didn't move. She took another step, her hand brushing against the damp wood of the doorframe. The opening was narrow, the interior swallowed in shadows. Her eyes adjusted slowly. She could make out a few vague shapes inside, an old wooden chair, the collapsed remains of a shelf, but there was something else. A darker shape near the back, low to the ground. The scraping sound came again, and this time it was followed by something that made her freeze entirely, a muffled voice. She couldn't make out the words, but it was unmistakably human. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She stepped back instinctively, glancing over her shoulder into the fog. But there was nothing behind her. Just the shifting white and the silent trees. The voice came again, clearer this time, but still too low for her to understand. It didn't sound like it was calling for help. It was quieter, more measured. Almost like it was talking to itself, or to someone else she couldn't hear. The cubs didn't move, but their eyes darted between her and the shed. The bigger one chuffed again, and she realized it wasn't just urging her forward, it was warning her. She stepped back fully now, her boots crunching softly against the pine needles. Whatever was in that shed, the cubs didn't want her to go inside. But they had brought her here for a reason. And she had the unsettling feeling that reason wasn't going away if she just turned around and left. She took one last look at the shed, the sagging roof, the black opening of the door, then at the cubs. The smaller one shifted its paws nervously, then glanced toward a path that led deeper into the forest. The bigger one followed its gaze. She understood then, the shed wasn't the destination. It was just the beginning. And whatever lay ahead in the fog was bigger than she had imagined. The cubs were already moving before she could decide whether to follow. The bigger one glanced back once, making sure she saw which direction they were going, then padded into the fog. The smaller one trailed close behind, their silhouettes quickly dissolving into pale white. She took one last look at the shed, committing the shape of it to memory, and then stepped after them. The air beyond the shed seemed heavier somehow, as if the fog had thickened the moment they passed it. Every step made the forest feel less familiar. She recognized certain tree shapes or the way the ground sloped, but it was as though she were walking through a memory instead of reality, something close to the truth but slightly wrong in ways she couldn't quite name. The cubs moved faster now, but not so quickly that she couldn't keep pace. They weren't playful. They weren't exploring. They had a destination, and every movement was angled toward it. That urgency bled into her bones, making her walk more quickly despite the way her boots slipped on the damp, root-tangled ground. The sound she'd heard earlier, the faint rhythmic thud, returned, but it was sharper now, more defined. She counted the beats between each sound and realized there was a pause, as though something was being set down and then lifted again. It could have been a tool, but it didn't have the metallic ring she expected. It was duller. Almost like a piece of wood striking something solid. The cubs didn't slow, but she noticed their ears twitch at the noise. They knew it was there, and they didn't like it. Then she smelled it again, that metallic tang, stronger this time, almost enough to make her gag. She pressed her scarf over her nose and mouth, breathing shallowly. The cubs didn't seem to react to the smell itself, but their pace grew more urgent. A fallen tree blocked part of the trail ahead, its trunk slick with moss. The bigger cub scrambled over it easily, but she had to brace herself against the bark to climb. Her gloves picked up the damp scent of rot, and for a moment she thought she felt the faint movement of something burrowing inside the wood. She forced herself not to look too closely. On the other side of the tree, the ground dipped sharply into a hollow. The fog pooled thickest there, swirling in slow, deliberate patterns as if stirred by an unseen hand. She could barely make out shapes at the bottom, the cubs standing close together, their heads turned towards something just out of her line of sight. She slid down the slope, her boots slipping on loose earth. The smell hit her full in the face at the bottom, and she staggered, pulling her scarf tighter. Through the fog, she saw it, a small clearing, the earth churned and disturbed as though something had been recently buried or unearthed. At the far end of the clearing stood a figure. It was human, that much she could tell, but the details were lost in the haze. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing something dark that merged with the shadows. The figure was bent slightly forward, both hands working at the ground with a long-handled tool. The dull thud she'd been hearing was the tool striking earth, again and again. She froze, every muscle in her body tense. The cubs didn't make a sound, but they stayed close to her now, one on each side, their fur brushing against her legs. It felt like they were anchoring her in place. The figure didn't seem to notice her at first. It kept working, movements slow but relentless, like it had been at it for a long time. Then, without warning, it stopped. The head turned, not all the way, just enough to suggest it had heard something. She realized with a start that the forest around them was so quiet she could hear her own pulse in her ears. The figure straightened and finally turned fully toward her. Even through the fog, she saw the face, pale, gaunt, with eyes that looked too deep in the sockets. The mouth moved, but she couldn't hear the words. The cubs stiffened. The bigger one gave a low, steady growl, the first truly aggressive sound she'd heard from them. The figure tilted its head slightly, watching her. Then, without another word, it stepped backward into the fog. 1 step. 2. And then it was gone. She stood frozen for a moment, her breath coming faster. Her mind raced with questions. Who was that? What were they burying or digging up? Why had the cubs brought her here? But no answers came. Only the fog, curling in where the figure had been, erasing every trace. The disturbed ground was still there, though. She took a hesitant step forward, eyes scanning the churned soil. Something pale poked through, not bone, she thought at first, but fabric. She crouched and brushed away a bit of the dirt, revealing a strip of canvas. It was stained, the color hard to tell in the muted light, but it looked like it had been there a while. The cubs shifted beside her, clearly uneasy. The bigger one bumped its head against her arm, not playfully but insistently. It was enough to pull her upright again. The rhythmic sound had stopped completely. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, pressing against her from every side. She didn't want to be in the clearing anymore. Without a word, the cubs turned and began climbing the slope out of the hollow. She followed, her boots slipping again on the loose earth, her eyes flicking back to the spot where the figure had stood. She half expected to see it again, watching her from the edge of the fog. But there was nothing. At the top of the slope, she paused to catch her breath. The cubs didn't stop moving. They pushed forward, back into the thicker part of the forest, and she realized they weren't leading her home. They were leading her somewhere else entirely. Somewhere deeper. And the strangest part was, she found herself willing to go. She followed the cubs without speaking, their small shapes just visible ahead in the swirling fog. The clearing with the disturbed ground faded into the mist behind her, though it still clung to her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the figure again, pale and still, watching her from some hidden corner of the forest. The cubs moved in a steady line, never hesitating. They didn't veer toward familiar landmarks or the usual paths she'd walked before. Instead, they wove between thicker clusters of pines, their trunks so close together she had to turn sideways to slip through. The ground here was different, spongier underfoot, littered with old needles and rotting branches. Her sense of direction was gone. The fog made every angle feel the same, every tree blend into the next. Without the cubs, she wouldn't have been able to retrace her steps even if she wanted to. The thought settled uncomfortably in her chest, they weren't just leading her somewhere. They were also making sure she didn't turn back. The smell that had followed her since the shed was fainter now, replaced by the sharp tang of wet earth. But every so often, a whisper of that metallic scent returned, carried in brief gusts that made her stop and glance around. Each time, the cubs paused too, looking back at her as though to check she was still coming. Then she heard it again, that sound. Not the dull thud of digging this time, but something different. A faint metallic rattle, followed by a soft creak. She slowed, straining to hear. The noise came again, somewhere ahead, and this time it was followed by a hollow clang, like a chain brushing against metal. The cubs didn't react with fear. Instead, their pace quickened, paused silent on the damp ground. She had to push herself to keep up, her breath clouding in the cold air. The sound grew clearer, a slow, irregular rhythm, as if someone was moving something heavy. The fog thinned briefly, revealing a break in the trees. She stepped into it and found herself staring at another clearing, though this one was smaller than the last. In the center stood what looked like the rusted remains of an old water tank or silo, its surface streaked with brown from decades of rain. A chain hung loosely from a hatch near the bottom, swaying slightly even though there was no wind. The cubs stopped at the edge of the clearing, watching her closely. The bigger one's head tilted toward the tank, its eyes fixed on the hatch. She approached slowly, her boots sinking into the soft, moss-covered ground. The chain clinked softly with each step she took, the sound oddly loud in the heavy silence. She stopped a few feet from the tank, her gaze fixed on the dark gap of the hatch opening. At first, she thought it was empty inside. But then she caught movement, a shift in the shadows, quick and deliberate. She froze, her muscles tensing, every sense sharpening. A voice came from inside. It was muffled, just like the one she'd heard at the shed, but closer now. Too close. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was wrong. It was steady, almost conversational, but with a strange emphasis on certain syllables that made her skin prickle. The cubs growled softly, not loud enough to be a threat, but enough to send a ripple of unease through her. The voice stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. Then came a scrape, something metal dragging across the inside of the hatch, and a dull thump, like weight shifting against the floor. She took an instinctive step back. From the darkness of the hatch, a hand appeared. It was pale, dirt-streaked, the nails cracked and rimmed with soil. The fingers curled against the edge as if testing its strength. Then, slowly, the rest of the figure emerged, hunched, movements deliberate. She recognized the same gaunt frame from the clearing, the same deep-set eyes that seemed to pull in all the light around them. He didn't speak. He just looked at her, then at the cubs, then back at her again. Something in that gaze was measuring, as if he was deciding whether she was worth acknowledging at all. The cubs pressed closer to her legs now, their fur brushing against her jeans. The bigger one gave a short, sharp huff, a sound that seemed meant for him. His lips twitched in what might have been the shadow of a smile, though there was nothing warm about it. Without a word, he stepped away from the hatch and into the fog on the far side of the clearing, disappearing as suddenly as he had before. She stood frozen for several seconds, the clink of the swaying chain filling the air in his absence. The cubs moved first, padding toward the spot where he had vanished. They sniffed the ground briefly, then turned in unison toward a narrow trail she hadn't noticed before, barely visible between the moss and fallen branches. She didn't know why she was still following them. Logic told her to turn back, to find her way home while she still could. But something deeper, something she couldn't explain, told her this wasn't over. The cubs had come for her, had brought her here for a reason. If she left now, that reason would remain hidden. The cubs set off again, slipping into the narrow trail without hesitation. She gave one last glance at the rusted tank, the hatch still hanging open, then tightened her scarf and stepped into the path after them. The fog closed around her again, and the sound of the chain faded behind her. The narrow trail wound through a section of forest she'd never walked before. The trees here grew close together, their trunks dark with moisture, branches bending low enough that she had to duck to pass beneath them. The fog was thinner in this stretch, but it clung stubbornly to the ground, curling around her boots with every step. The cubs stayed close, never more than a few feet ahead. Every so often, the bigger one would pause and glance back at her, as if making sure she was still there. The smaller one kept its nose low, sniffing the earth in quick bursts. It wasn't aimless movement, they were tracking something. Her mind kept replaying the image of the man emerging from the hatch. His eyes had been wrong. Not just tired or empty, but calculating in a way that made her stomach twist. And that smile, if it could even be called that, felt like it hadn't been meant for her at all, but for the cubs. As though he'd recognized them. The ground sloped gently downward, and the air grew colder. She could hear water now, a soft trickle, the kind that came from a slow-moving stream. The sound was comforting in its familiarity, but it was soon joined by something else, a faint metallic hum. It was steady, low-pitched, and entirely out of place in the forest. She slowed her steps, trying to locate its source. The cubs didn't seem alarmed, but their pace quickened, pulling her forward. The hum grew louder until it became a vibration she could feel in her chest. The trail ended abruptly at the edge of a shallow ravine. The stream she'd heard ran along the bottom, its surface rippling with the movement of the water. A fallen tree served as a makeshift bridge, its bark stripped bare, wood bleached pale by weather. Beyond the ravine, partially hidden by the rise of the opposite bank, was a structure. It wasn't like the shed or the water tank. This was larger, a squat, rectangular building made of concrete, its surface cracked and streaked with black where rainwater had run down over the years. A chain-link fence surrounded it, though parts had been bent or cut. The hum was coming from inside. The cubs didn't hesitate. They crossed the fallen tree one at a time, paws sure and silent. She followed more slowly, her arms out for balance. The wood flexed faintly under her weight, but it held. On the far side, the cubs led her through a gap in the fence. The chain links were curled outward, as if something had pushed from inside. The metal edges caught her jacket sleeve, snagging the fabric. She pulled free with a sharp tug, her gaze flicking instinctively toward the building's dark windows. Up close, the sound was almost oppressive. It wasn't mechanical in the usual sense, more like a deep, constant resonance, the kind you feel more than hear. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to shake the sensation. The cubs stopped near the building's side, just beneath one of the small, square windows. They didn't look inside, but they didn't move away either. The bigger one's ears were angled back slightly, a posture she'd learned meant caution. She stepped up to the wall, careful to keep her movements quiet. The concrete was cold under her palm. She rose onto her toes to peer through the window. The glass was dirty, streaked with grime, but she could still make out shapes inside. It was a single large room, empty except for something in the center, a table or perhaps an altar of some kind, though it was too far to see clearly. A single bare bulb hung above it, swaying slightly even though there was no breeze. She thought she saw movement in the shadows at the far end of the room, but it was too dark to be certain. Then a faint scraping sound reached her ears, slow, deliberate. She stepped back instinctively, her boot crunching softly on gravel. The cubs reacted instantly. The bigger one moved in front of her, its stance low, head forward. The smaller one stayed at her side, but its eyes were locked on the window. The hum seemed to deepen. Or maybe her own heartbeat was just syncing with it. Either way, the sound was in her bones now, vibrating through her like a second pulse. She took a slow breath, trying to steady herself. She didn't know what this place was, or why the cubs had brought her here, but she was certain now, the man in the fog had been connected to it. The way he'd looked at her, the path he'd taken, the direction the cubs had chosen afterward, it was all leading here. From inside, the scraping stopped. Then, faintly, came that same voice she'd heard before. Muffled, almost like it was speaking through the walls. She still couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, calm, steady, and entirely wrong. The cubs didn't move. They stayed anchored where they were, as if waiting for her to decide what happened next. She realized she had two choices. She could leave now, turn back through the fence, find her way to the safety of her cabin. Or she could follow the trail to its end, whatever that end might be. The cubs seemed to know which choice she would make. They turned toward a door at the side of the building, its paint long since peeled away, hinges rusted but intact. The bigger cub paused beside it, looking over its shoulder at her. Her hand tightened into a fist inside her glove. Then, slowly, she stepped forward, the hum filling her ears, the fog curling at her back. The door looked like it hadn't been opened in years, but the ground in front of it told a different story. The moss there had been disturbed, flattened in patches that matched the size of boots. Fresh enough that the green hadn't grown back. The cubs didn't push forward. They waited, the bigger one sitting back on its haunches while the smaller one shifted restlessly from paw to paw. She placed her hand on the doorframe, the cold seeping through her glove. Up close, the hum from inside seemed to throb against her skin, like the building itself was alive. She leaned in and pressed her ear to the wood. Beneath the constant hum, she thought she heard movement, soft, deliberate. A faint click of metal. Then the same voice as before, closer now, though still muffled by the wall. It spoke in short bursts, pauses between each phrase, like someone giving instructions. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the door. She didn't want to open it, not really. But the cubs had led her here, step by step, as if this was the only destination that mattered. She gave the handle a cautious turn. It resisted at first, then gave with a quiet groan. She pushed the door just enough to peek inside. The interior smelled of damp concrete and something else, something sharper, almost chemical. The light inside was dim, coming from a few bare bulbs along the ceiling. The room stretched longer than she expected, the far end fading into shadow. In the center stood the table she'd glimpsed through the window. It wasn't wood, but metal, the surface scratched and dented. Beside it were objects she couldn't immediately identify, some tools, some containers, all arranged with deliberate precision. She stepped inside, her boots leaving faint prints on the dust-coated floor. The cubs didn't follow. They stayed at the threshold, their dark eyes tracking her every movement. The hum was louder here, resonating through the walls and floor. She realized it was coming from somewhere below her, maybe a basement or sublevel she couldn't see. Halfway to the table, she froze. The voice came again, this time so clear it felt like it was right beside her. "Not yet," it said. Just 2 words, calm and measured. She turned sharply, but there was no one there. The space behind her was empty except for the cubs at the doorway. Her breath quickened. A faint scraping sound came from her left. She turned and saw a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. The hum seemed to pour out of it, thicker now, vibrating in her chest. The scraping grew louder, then stopped. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, but the cubs didn't move. The bigger one's head tilted slightly, as if encouraging her forward. She couldn't explain why, but she stepped toward the stairs. The air grew colder with each step down. The walls were rough concrete, damp to the touch. About halfway down, she noticed faint marks along the wall, scratches, uneven and clustered. She ran her fingers over them and felt the grooves dig deep into the stone. They weren't random. They looked desperate. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened into a low-ceilinged room. The hum was almost physical here, pressing against her skin. Along one wall stood a series of metal cabinets, their doors secured with heavy latches. In the center was another table, smaller than the one upstairs, but covered in objects, more tools, lengths of chain, and something that looked like a small, battered radio. She took a cautious step closer, her eyes scanning the room. That's when she saw it. Against the far wall, half hidden in shadow, was a wooden crate. The lid was loose, resting slightly askew. She moved toward it, each step slow and deliberate. The hum seemed to recede slightly, as if pulling back in anticipation. She reached the crate and placed her hand on the lid. The wood was damp, soft around the edges. She lifted it just enough to see inside. What she saw made her recoil. Inside were strips of fabric, torn, frayed, and stained with something dark. Some were pieces of clothing, small enough that they might have belonged to a child. Beneath them, half buried, was a carved wooden figure. It was simple, almost crude, but unmistakable, a bear, small and rounded, with 2 cubs at its side. She stared at it, her pulse hammering. The carving was worn smooth in places, as if it had been handled often. She reached out and picked it up, the wood warm against her skin despite the cold in the room. From the stairwell behind her came the sound of a footstep. Slow. Heavy. Deliberate. She turned, clutching the carving tightly. A shadow filled the bottom of the stairs. Then, the pale figure stepped into the room. His eyes went straight to the carving in her hand. His mouth curved into that same unsettling, almost smile. "You found it," he said softly. The cubs growled from the top of the stairs, their voices low but sharp. The man's gaze shifted past her, toward them. Then, without breaking eye contact, he took a single step forward. Her fingers tightened around the small carved bear until the edges bit into her palm. The man's footsteps were slow, deliberate, each one tapping faintly against the damp concrete. The hum that had been pressing in on her seemed to fade slightly, replaced by the sound of her own breathing, shallow, quick. He stopped a few paces away, tilting his head just enough to let the dim light catch the deep hollows under his eyes. "You shouldn't be here," he said, though his voice carried none of the urgency such words should have. It was calm, almost curious, as though he was testing her reaction. The cubs growled again from the top of the stairs. The smaller one's paws shifted against the concrete, ready to move, while the bigger one stood completely still, its head low, eyes locked on the man. "I didn't come here alone," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. He glanced toward the cubs, the faintest curve of his mouth returning. "I see that." His gaze slid back to the carving in her hand. "That's not yours." Her grip on it didn't loosen. "It was in your crate. Along with clothes that look like they belonged to children." He took one slow step closer. "Things get lost in the woods all the time." The words might have been harmless in a different tone, but here, in the cold dim of the basement, they carried weight. She could feel her pulse in her neck, the fine hairs on her arms rising beneath her jacket. The cubs gave another low growl, more insistent this time. The man's eyes flicked toward them again, and his expression shifted, not fear, but calculation. He seemed to weigh something in his mind before taking another step forward. "I think," she said, her voice steadying despite the thudding in her chest, "you should stay where you are." "And if I don't?" he asked. She didn't answer, but the cubs did, a sharp, sudden bark from the bigger one, the kind of sound meant to warn. The man froze mid-step, the smallest flicker of irritation passing over his face. "You think they'll protect you?" His voice had dropped, lower now, with a texture that felt almost like a challenge. "They already have," she said. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then his eyes shifted to the carving again. "Give it to me." She shook her head. Something in his jaw tightened. Without warning, he stepped back, not toward the stairs but to the side, disappearing into a narrow alcove that branched off from the main room. She couldn't see where it led, but the sound of his boots faded quickly, swallowed by the hum. The cubs were in motion instantly. The bigger one bounded down the stairs, the smaller right behind. They reached her side in seconds, their small bodies pressing against her legs. She crouched, one hand resting briefly on the bigger cub's back, grounding herself in their solid presence. The alcove where the man had gone was empty now, but a faint draft moved through it, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and something metallic. She hesitated at the opening, the cubs flanking her, then stepped inside. The passage was narrow, the walls closer here, rough concrete giving way to packed soil in places. Her boots scuffed against the ground, the sound swallowed almost instantly by the hum that grew louder with each step. She could hear the cubs breathing beside her, their small paws soft on the floor. The passage opened into another room, smaller than the last, with no windows. The man wasn't there. In his place was something far more unsettling, a circle of objects arranged on the floor. At first glance, they looked like stones, but as she stepped closer, she realized they were carved figures. Each one was different, some animals, some human shapes, all worn smooth with age. In the center of the circle lay another carved bear, larger than the one she held, its head bowed as if in submission. Her stomach tightened. The cubs didn't growl this time. Instead, they walked straight to the center of the circle and sat on either side of the larger carving. Their eyes turned to her, unblinking. She knelt, the carving still in her hand, and placed it gently beside the larger one. The moment the wood touched wood, the hum shifted. It wasn't louder or softer, it was different. Less mechanical, more like a low note sustained on a wind instrument. The air felt heavier, and for a second she thought the walls themselves were vibrating. From somewhere beyond the room came the sound of a door opening. The man's voice followed, faint but distinct, "It's time." The cubs stood. The bigger one gave a short chuff and walked to the far wall, where a thin crack of light seeped through. The smaller one followed, pausing only to glance back at her. She moved toward them, the hum still resonating in her bones. At the wall, she saw that the light came from a narrow opening just wide enough for the cubs to pass through. Beyond it was fog, thick, rolling, the same as the morning mist she'd first seen them in. The cubs slipped through without hesitation. She crouched to follow, pausing only to glance back once. The carvings were still in place, the larger bear and its two cubs side by side. Then she turned and stepped into the fog. The hum faded instantly, replaced by the muffled quiet of the forest. The cubs were waiting a few feet ahead, their shapes barely visible in the mist. She had no idea where the man was now, or what he had meant by its time. But she knew the cubs were still leading her, and she wasn't ready to stop following. The moment she stepped through the narrow gap, the forest swallowed her again. The fog was heavier than before, curling around the trees like slow-moving smoke. The sound of the hum from the building was gone, leaving only the faint rustle of unseen branches and the soft pad of the cub's paws ahead of her. Her heart was still thudding from what she'd seen in that basement, the carvings, the man's words, the way the cubs had gone straight to the center of that strange circle as if they'd known exactly where they belonged. She didn't know how long the man had been collecting those pieces or why, but something in her gut told her it had been going on for years. The cubs moved with purpose again. They didn't dart or pause to sniff, they kept to a steady path, slipping between tree trunks as though they were following a line only they could see. She kept her pace with them, her breath visible in the cold air. The ground here was different from the other parts of the forest. The moss was thicker, springy under her boots, and the air carried the faint scent of water, clean, fresh, like a mountain spring. The fog shifted slightly, revealing a darker shape ahead. At first, she thought it was a rock formation. But as they drew closer, she realized it was a tree, or what was left of one. The trunk was massive, at least 10 feet across, but it had been split down the middle, the wood jagged and dark with age. The split was wide enough for a person to walk through. The cubs didn't hesitate. They slipped inside, vanishing into the hollow space. She followed, her shoulders brushing the rough inner walls as she passed through. Inside, the air was warmer, still thick with mist but carrying a subtle scent of something floral, faint, almost hidden under the damp earth smell. The hollowed-out space opened into a small clearing, completely encircled by the remains of the tree's trunk. In the center was something she hadn't expected, another carving. It was larger than the one she'd carried and more detailed than the others she'd seen. The bear's features were etched with care, every curve of muscle, every strand of fur marked in the wood. But the most striking detail was its eyes. They had been inlaid with something dark, almost black, that caught the dim light even in the fog. The cubs approached the carving and sat in front of it. Their posture was still, almost reverent. She stepped closer, crouching to study it. The black in the eyes wasn't paint. It looked like polished stone, obsidian, maybe. She ran her fingers lightly over the surface, the wood cool and smooth beneath her touch. A faint sound broke the silence, not from the forest, but from somewhere beyond the carving. It was the man's voice again, distant yet somehow clear. "You've come farther than most," he said. She straightened, scanning the fog. She couldn't see him, but his voice felt close, as if it was coming from the air itself. "What do you want?" she asked. The pause before he answered was long enough to make her uneasy. "I don't want anything," he said. "But they do." Her eyes flicked to the cubs. They hadn't moved, but their ears twitched slightly, as if they heard him too. "What are they looking for?" she asked. This time, the silence stretched even longer. She was about to speak again when his voice came, softer now. "A way home." The fog shifted at the far end of the clearing, and for a moment she thought she saw him, a pale outline, unmoving, just beyond the split in the tree. But when she blinked, it was gone. The cubs rose and began walking toward the far side of the clearing. They didn't look back at her this time. She followed, her boots making almost no sound on the mossy ground. They passed through another opening in the tree's trunk, emerging into a part of the forest she didn't recognize. The fog was thinning here, letting more of the cold gray light through. She realized they were moving uphill now, the slope gentle but steady. As they climbed, the air grew sharper, carrying with it a faint breeze. She could hear something ahead, not the hum, not the man's voice, but water. Faster than a stream this time, more like a river. The cubs picked up their pace, and when they crested the rise, she saw it, a wide river cutting through the forest, its surface shrouded in mist. In the middle of the river was a small island, barely more than a mound of rock and soil, but on it stood another carving. Even from the bank, she could see it was different. Taller, narrower, its shape almost like a totem, but the top was unmistakably a bear's head. The cubs stopped at the water's edge. They looked at her, then at the island, then back at her again. She didn't need them to speak to understand, they wanted her to go. But the river's current was strong, and the water looked freezing. Crossing it would be dangerous. She crouched beside them, her hand resting lightly on the bigger cub's back. "Is this where you've been trying to take me?" she asked quietly. Neither cub moved, but both held her gaze. From somewhere behind her came a faint sound, the snap of a twig underfoot. She spun, scanning the fog-covered bank, but saw nothing. The cub's ears angled back, and the smaller one let out a soft chuff. She turned back to the river, the island's carving standing like a sentinel in the mist. She didn't know what would happen if she crossed. But she knew, deep in her bones, that the man was somewhere nearby, and that whatever warning the cubs had brought her, she was standing at the edge of it. The morning broke pale and still, the fog lying low over the clearing like a blanket that hadn't yet been pulled away. She rose earlier than usual, restless from dreams that felt more like memories, the hollow, the cabin, the cubs moving through the mist as if on a path only they understood. She made her way to the clearing expecting to see them in their usual spot at the first touch of sunlight. But they weren't there. Her breath misted in the cold air as she scanned the tree line. Nothing. No dark shapes against the frost, no slow padding steps breaking the quiet. For a moment, she thought they simply wouldn't come today. Then, movement, a flicker in the fog to her left. The larger cub emerged first, not from the trail to the hollow, but from deeper in the forest. The smaller followed, their heads low, their pace steady. They didn't stop at the edge of the clearing. Instead, they crossed it without hesitation, passing close enough that she could hear the soft crunch of frost beneath their paws. They didn't look at her. They simply kept moving, heading toward a stretch of trees she'd never seen them approach before. She followed without thinking, her boots leaving a faint track behind theirs. The fog clung to the ground, muffling sound, and every now and then she caught glimpses of the cubs ahead, their fur dark against the pale air, tails flicking slightly as they walked. After several minutes, the terrain began to rise. The forest thinned, and the ground turned to rocky soil scattered with patches of brittle grass. A faint breeze stirred, carrying a sharper scent, cold stone, old wood, and something faintly metallic. The cubs climbed the slope without pause, disappearing over the crest. She followed, her legs burning from the incline, and stopped at the top. Below, in a shallow valley, stood a small wooden structure. It wasn't a cabin, not exactly, more like a shed or an outbuilding. The roof sagged, and the walls leaned at odd angles, but the door was still intact. The cubs were waiting at the base of the slope, glancing back at her before moving toward the door. The larger sat beside it while the smaller pawed lightly at the wood, producing a hollow thud. She descended carefully, her boots slipping on loose stone. At the bottom, she paused in front of the door. Up close, she could see deep scratches along the wood, some old and weathered, others fresh. Her hand went to the latch. It was stiff, rusted, but not locked. She pushed, and the door swung inward with a reluctant groan. The interior was dim, lit only by the narrow gaps between the warped boards. Dust hung in the air, and the scent of damp earth was stronger here. Against the far wall sat a wooden chest, smaller than the box in the hollow but built from the same weathered planks. She stepped inside, the cubs slipping in behind her. The chest's lid creaked when she opened it. Inside was a folded length of oilskin, and beneath that, a bundle wrapped in burlap. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside were photographs, black and white prints, edges curling, the images faded but still clear enough to see. In one, a man stood beside the leaning pine, two bear cubs at his feet. In another, the same man knelt by the hollow, his hand resting gently on the back of an adult bear. Her fingers trembled slightly as she flipped through them. In every image, the man's face was calm, his eyes steady. In the corner of one photo, barely visible, were the initials J.R. written in neat block letters. She looked down at the cubs. They weren't watching the photographs, they were watching her. And for the first time, she felt certain they'd brought her here not to discover something new, but to confirm something they already knew. The river felt colder on the way back. Each step into the current sent the chill deeper into her bones, and the mist clung closer, as though it wanted to keep her on the island. She kept her eyes on the cubs at the far bank. They hadn't moved, but their tails flicked with restless energy, and the bigger one gave a short huff every few seconds, urging her forward. Halfway across, she stopped. The man was there again. He stood on the bank, a few feet from the cubs, pale against the dark backdrop of trees. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the island she'd just left, his expression unreadable. "You've seen enough," he said, though his voice carried no anger. If anything, it sounded tired. She kept moving, boots slipping against the slick river stones. The cubs didn't take their eyes off him, their small bodies angled between him and the water's edge. When she reached the bank, the bigger cub stepped forward to press its head lightly against her leg, as if checking she was solid, still here. The smaller one stayed tense, its ears pinned. The man shifted his gaze to her. "You don't understand what you've walked into." "Then tell me," she said, her breath clouding in the cold. He glanced toward the fog drifting over the water. "Some things aren't meant to be told. Only carried." Her fingers tightened around the carved bear in her pocket, the smaller one she'd taken from the basement. "Is that what this is? Something I'm meant to carry?" His eyes flicked toward her pocket, then back to her face. "You've already decided to." She took a step closer, the cubs shadowing her. "What happens now?" His mouth curved slightly, that same almost smile she'd seen before. "Now, they'll keep finding you." The words sat heavy in the air. She didn't ask who they were. Some part of her already knew, or at least understood that the answer wouldn't be simple. The cubs gave a sharp bark, breaking the moment. They turned toward the slope leading away from the river, their bodies angled to move. She followed, but glanced back once. The man was still there, watching. As the fog closed around him, his pale shape blurred, then vanished entirely. The climb away from the river was slow, the slope slick with moss and wet leaves. The cubs led steadily, their pace unhurried but determined. She tried to mark her surroundings, but everything looked the same trees, the same mist curling low to the ground. After what felt like an hour, the fog began to thin. Patches of pale blue sky showed through the canopy, and the air lost its sharp, metallic edge. She recognized the curve of a familiar path, one she'd walked countless times from her cabin. When they reached the edge of the clearing near her property, the cubs stopped. They stood side by side, looking up at her with those dark, unreadable eyes. She crouched, resting her hand on the bigger cub's head, then on the smaller one's. "You brought me there for a reason," she said softly. "I'm just not sure what it is yet." The bigger cub gave a quiet chuff. The smaller one's ears twitched. For a moment, they stayed still. Then, without a sound, they turned and slipped back into the trees. She stayed kneeling, listening until the sound of their movement faded completely. The clearing felt different now, quieter, but not empty. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small carved bear, its smooth surface warm from her hand. The image of the island's carving, with its obsidian eyes, rose in her mind. The markings at its base. The man's voice saying they'll keep finding you. She didn't know what it meant. But she knew the cubs would come back. And when they did, the trail they led her on might go deeper than she could imagine. Back inside her cabin, she set the carving on the table. The hum was gone here, replaced by the crackle of her small wood stove. She stared at the bear's shape in the firelight, the way the flicker of flames seemed to make it shift, just enough to make her wonder if it was truly still. Outside, the fog lingered low in the trees, curling slowly, as if waiting.